Tonight, Cory is here to talk about In Real Life, his new graphic novel. I think it's first, we've done one collection, this is the first real graphic novel he's done. And I forget the artist's name, I apologize.
Jen Wang.
Jen Wang. I think the book is lovely and beautiful, and as all the Cory things, doesn't make you think while you read it, then you're just doing something wrong. Please welcome Cory Doctorow.
Thank you. Thanks, Dwayne. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Dwayne. That McSweeney's book that Dwayne mentioned there, I have a new book out approximately next week called Information Doesn't Want to Be Free, with introductions by Neil Gaiman and Amanda Palmer. That's a book about internet policy and related issues. So that's why I'm coming back next week. I'm going to be back for that. And I'll also be back this summer. I'm going to teach the Clarion West workshop. So I hope to see some of you then as well, along with my students who are always promising and bright-eyed. So as you know, Bob, I'm a science fiction writer. And being a science fiction writer is not like having a regular job. It's weird, and when you tell people you're a science fiction writer, it sounds like you made it up. It sounds like, you know, when people ask you, what do you do for a living, and you say, I write science fiction, it sort of sounds like you've said, I paint the stripes on the bees, I maintain the Tooth Fairy's wand, and they never know what to say when you say that. There's this kind of blank moment, and then there's a kind of moment's cogitation, and then often what comes next is, gosh, that must be hard, you know, with the future happening so quickly these days, overtaking you. How do you make predictions in like the 21st century? And I totally understand where this question comes from, but I reject it. It drives me crazy because I don't think science fiction writers predict. I think some science fiction writers think they predict, they're just wrong. Science fiction has made a lot of predictions since the time of Mary Shelley, and it would be alarming if none of them had come true. I mean, you throw enough darts, some of them will hit the target. But this process whereby we cherry pick a few science fiction predictions that have come right for some definition of right, and then declare science fiction to be the literature of prediction, is a bit like the man who fires the shotgun into the side of the barn and then draws a bullseye around the place where all the pellets have hit, and then lauds his own marksmanship. Science fiction's predictive value is vastly overstated, but that doesn't mean that science fiction doesn't do some important things in relation to the future. Two in particular that I'm going to talk about tonight that relate directly to this book, In Real Life, and all of the other stories that it grew out of. The first thing that science fiction does is it helps us inspire the future. It helps make the future. Prediction is a bit of a fraught business because it kind of implies that the future is fixed. So if you can gaze into a crystal ball and imagine what the future will be, it implies that the future is foreordained. And if the future is foreordained, why should any of us get out of bed, right? It's going to happen no matter what we do. But inspiring the future, that's pretty interesting, because if you can inspire the future, then you can change the future. So Motorola flip phones didn't look like Star Trek communicators because Gene Roddenberry practiced witchcraft and managed to know that in 20 years, the creations of his set designers would be on people's hips. Gene Roddenberry made a TV show called Star Trek that all of the Motorola engineers watched growing up, and when someone asked them to make something that looked as futuristic as possible, their childhood dreams swam into their hindbrains, and out came the flip phone because that was the most futuristic thing they could think of, and of course now it's quite antiquated looking. So science fiction writers can predict the future. That's good. But what's really cool that science fiction writers can do is they can help diagnose the present. And diagnosing the present is an increasingly important thing to do. There's a wonderful academic down at UC Irvine named Mimi Ito, ITO. She's, if you know Joey Ito, who runs the MIT Media Lab, it's his sister. And Mimi runs the MacArthur Digital Youth Project, which is the largest study ever done of how young Americans use the internet. And it's ongoing, so new work is done all the time on it. And she often gives talks, and when she gives talks, people ask her, what are tablets doing to our children's brains? And tablets do things to your brain because your brain is what you think with. So if you think, then something has happened to your brain, right? Whether you're thinking about whether you should brush your teeth, or thinking about whether you're going to be late for work, or thinking about whether all 7 castaways on Gilligan's Island really map to the 7 deadly sins, you have changed your brain. So tablets undoubtedly change your brain, but there's not really any good methodology for figuring out what tablets are doing to our brains until we've had some time to look backwards, so we can sort out the noise from the signal. So in 10 years, we might be able to make some good guesses about what tablets have done to our brains, but in 10 years, tablets will not be around as we understand them. They'll be as retro and outdated and outmoded looking as a Motorola flip phone is today. So if we want to unpick how tablets and the other places where the past is meeting the future, the present, and figure out what we can do to steer that future, then we need to be able to diagnose things whose effects are very diffused and hard to put your finger on. We need to be able to do that in real time and not in retrospect. And that's where science fiction comes in. Not by making predictions, but by building models, and not by building accurate models, but by building specifically inaccurate models. Just like when you go to the doctor and you have a tickle in the back of your throat, and she knows that if she just leaves you long enough, and if it's something really horrible, you'll get sick enough that she'll be able to diagnose you at a glance. But that's not what she wants to do. She wants to know whatever gunk is growing in the back of your throat before it's fatal. And so she'll touch the back of your throat with a swab and rub it on a petri dish and leave it over the weekend. And on Monday, she can put it under a slide on a microscope, and she can look at it and figure out what's going on in your throat. Again, not because she built an accurate model of your body, but because she built an inaccurate model of your body, specifically inaccurate. Inaccurate because there's only one fact about your body that is the totalizing fact of this model of your body. Whatever gunk was in the back of your throat is the only thing that matters in this model of your body in the petri dish. In the same way, a science fiction writer can reach into our society and pluck out one technology and grow a thought experiment world, not a predictive world, and not a world that's an accurate model of our world, but a model that is inaccurate in really useful ways. A world where that one technology is the totalizing fact of the world, whether it's surveillance, whether it's social media, whether it's any of the other classic themes we've seen in science fiction, and give us a guided tour of how that technology feels and kind of help us tease out of our very diffused reality where this technology is present in bits and pieces, a more deep understanding of what we'll think about it in maybe 10 or 15 years looking backwards. So it's kind of hindsight in advance. And there are lots of great examples of how this has worked. If it's 1947 and the peace dividend is in hand and we have all this great technology we invented to kill each other, like the TV and the radio and radar and the computer, cryptography, all these tools that were developed in World War II, we're trying to work out how to rebuild our society from the blasted rubble of this enormous, terrible war. Someone might say, well, let's just put cameras everywhere, and we'll watch what everyone does, and we'll know if someone does something wrong, and we can catch all the bad guys, and all of our social problems will end. And in 1947, that's a hard argument to rebut, because it sounds like a good idea. Sure, I want all the bad things to end. And the arguments against it are pretty dry and kind of bloodless and maybe academic even, in the sense that you end up saying things like, it would be creepy to live in that world, and it would change my behavior in ways that are difficult to articulate or predict, but that I think would make my life less genuine, less real. It would weaken my relationships to my neighbors and so on in ways that I can't quite put my finger on. But 1947, a man who'd been to the war, who had fought in the Spanish Civil War, who had been a successful novelist and journalist before the war, named Eric Blair, he sat down and wrote a novel called 1984, which he published under his well-known pen name, George Orwell. And in 1949, after that book had been around for a little while, if someone were to come to you with this discussion of cameras, you could say that's a bad idea because it's Orwellian, because Orwell became an adjective. And we were able to, with that one adjective, import all of the blood and tears and all of the lived horror that we experienced alongside Winston Smith when we read 1984. And that has been a touchstone in arguments about surveillance for more than half a century, right? So George Orwell didn't predict the future, but he gave us a hell of a tool for diagnosing our present. Which brings me to this. In around 2002, 2003, Slashdot, the nerdy news website, carried a report from the Game Developers Conference in San Francisco, GDC, at which someone had stood up to announce that he'd been doing something strange with the leading multiplayer online role-playing game of the day, a game called EverQuest. It was so addictive, people used to call it Evercrack. And EverQuest, whoops, I am not a PowerPoint jockey, as you can tell. My publisher said that this would be a good idea. EverQuest, like World of Warcraft, its progeny, EverQuest had a typical mechanic, and that mechanic was that in order to get to the part of the game where you were doing interesting things, you had to do a lot of boring things. There was a lot of carrot and a lot of, but even more stick to get to in the game. So there was a lot of like killing low-level monsters repeatedly. There was a lot of crafting where you would have to click on wool until it became a shirt really, really slowly. And that was how you would amass the gold and treasure and experience points and so on that you needed to get to the point where you could really get to the cool monsters and the cool weapons and the cool stuff. And this guy stood up and gave a presentation at GDC, and he said, I've figured out how to solve the EverQuest problem. I've bought a factory in Mexico, and I filled it with cheap laborers whom I pay pennies to play EverQuest all day. And then I sell the fruits of their virtual labor to rich Americans over eBay so that they don't have to do the boring, tedious work. Now, this was very controversial and newsworthy for two reasons. The first is it was just delightfully weird. What a strange way to cheat. And it certainly excited the economists who'd looked at the EverQuest economy and said, you know, it's at one point Ted Castronova calculated that it was like the 64th largest economy in the world. But it was also exciting and controversial because this guy had a reputation for being a pathological liar. So there was the extremely fun debate about whether or not he was telling the truth. But truth or not, I wrote this story, Anda's Game, that was published on Salon about someone who gets involved with gold farming. It's about a young girl named Anda who is in a school assembly one day when a glamorous woman comes to visit and says, you know, games are wonderful, but girls don't like to play them necessarily, and when they do, they play them in male avatars because of all the harassment, all the sexist insults that they have to bear, all of the bad sexist jokes and so on. And I think that's terrible. I want you to be able to play as young women. So I started this all-woman guild, and I will let you in, and you can be processed right into the guild and be a full-fledged member so long as you play as a girl. And this young girl, Anda, convinces her family to let her do it. And through the game, she finds sisterhood, she finds strength, she finds solidarity, she finds a community, and she really starts to find herself. And she plays and plays, and then one day one of her friends approaches her with a curious business offer that they can get real cash sent to their PayPal accounts if they go and kill these low-level characters that are sitting in a cottage making shirts all day. And she goes and she kills them, and lo and behold, she gets money, and she does it again, and she gets more money. And she's not sure what's going on, and something sure seems hinky about it. And then someone comes up to her and says, these are gold farmers. These are people who labor in the game. And when you kill them, they don't get to eat. They don't get to earn their pay. And they support their families with this work. And I'm here because I'm trying to start a trade union of gold farmers. And whenever I try, their bosses come and kill me. So would you like to help me? And after a lot of soul searching and a lot of debate with her colleagues and some falling out and some reconciliation, she finds that there is solidarity in the struggle for gender equity and the struggle for labor equity, that all struggles for justice are connected. So this is the story I wrote. And it was very well liked. It got reprinted in Best American Short Stories. It got reprinted in lots of other places. It won a ton of awards. And I write novels for Tor Books, as you may know. And Tor Books is in the Flatiron Building in Manhattan where all the Macmillan imprints are. And when I would go to visit them, I would sometimes go downstairs to the comics imprint at Macmillan, which is called First Second, so I could cadge free comics. And I would go and sort of schmooze with them, which is kind of a prerequisite if you're going to take the comics away. And they would always say, are you ever going to write something for us? And I had this idea, and I wrote this really ambitious adaptation of Anda's Game as like a 5-book set that would just kind of go on and on and on. I called it For the Win, and they hated it. So I wrote a novel based on Anda's Game called For the Win, which is around, and people love it, and whatever. But what they said was, we read the short story that you based this pitch on. Boy, we really like that. Why don't we adapt that? And so they sent me the portfolios of several artists. I picked one out whose work was really head and shoulders above everyone else's, a woman named Jen Wang who lived in Los Angeles. And she, in theory, was going to send me a script that I would do a big rewrite on to kind of capture the center of the story as only I, the creator, could know it. And then we would go back and forth, and she would do the art and so on. And actually, in practice, what happened is she sent me a script that was a sort of 85% perfect. And we had an extremely agreeable discussion about what kind of modifications it could make, where we had very few serious disputes, and the ones that were that did arise, our editor managed to resolve without any acrimony at all. It was like the world's least dramatic collaboration. And Jen did all the hard work. Like this beautiful book that you see these slides from, this is all Jen. She is amazing. And then I got an amazing surprise, which was when the book was done and they sent me the PDF of the jacket. I read her bio and realized that she'd written a graphic novel called Coco Be Good that I'd actually given it a really glowing review to. I'd loved it so much. And I just hadn't made the connection. I hadn't realized she was that Jen Wang. And so when I told her this, we hadn't ever met until 2 days ago. We met in Los Angeles earlier in this tour, and we toured in Los Angeles and San Francisco with each other yesterday and the day before. When I told her this, she kind of turned ashy pale and said, you know, I didn't realize, because you'd written that glowing review of my book, I assumed that you were like an easy marker, like you were like you love my work and I could do no wrong by you, and that's how I was able to like not have any anxiety about doing this book with you. If I'd known, I would have been really anxious. So Jen has some really sweet moves in this book. When she draws Anda's real life, it looks like this. This is Anda's life in Arizona. But when she draws, and she does she lays this filter on that makes it all very gray and brown. But when she draws the virtual world, there's this other filter that does these crazy colors you can see. Really beautiful stuff. And her illustration and character design and her pacing, I just love this book. And I can say that without feeling particularly boastful, because as I say, all the heavy lifting here is Jen's. So Anda's game predicted the present. And help diagnose the present. Because today, 400,000 people gold farm for a living, mostly in World of Warcraft. And the story of gold farming has appeared in the press several times because of different news hooks. And as it has, people have inevitably written to me to congratulate me on my prescience for making up gold farming. And of course, I didn't make it up. I just took a thing that existed in the world and wrote about it as though it was the one totalizing fact of the world, and people assumed that I'd made it up. It's a bit like Douglas Adams and his towel. You know, if you make up a world and act like you invented all the technology in it, people will assume that you really did. So, of course, gold farming has come true, but gold farming is also a kind of microcosm of some other stuff that I think is useful to understand about our present. One is what's happened to labor. So labor has become a lot more precarious. Gold farming is the ultimate at-will disposable employment, but it's not so far off from the Mechanical Turk or Fiverr or TaskRabbit. And not only has gaming's labor model moved into the rest of the world, but the paternalistic way that games are regulated or governed has also become the model for almost everything we do in the internet age. So if you've ever played a game, you know that the first thing you have to do with an online game is something you've never done in playing a game with your friends, which is that you have to click through a contract. And not just any contract, the world's most tedious, awful, abusive contract. A contract that can be boiled down to, you know, has anyone ever read one of those from top? You don't have to, because what they really all come down to is by being dumb enough to give us your money, you agree that we're allowed to come over to your house and punch your grandmother and wear your underwear and make long distance calls and eat all the food in your fridge, right? That's what they basically amount to. And yet, this is what passes for a constitution in a virtual world, right? If you're playing Dungeons and Dragons with your friends, or Monopoly, or even poker, and you don't like the way the dealer is dealing the hand, you can say, my turn next, or we're not playing with you anymore, or can we reconsider this? You have some constitutional recourse in those games, but in a virtual world, it's not we the people, it's you the suckers. And if you don't like the way it works, you can hit the bricks. And that model has moved into everything we do. If you want to chat with your friends, you don't need to sign a contract unless you're chatting with your friends on Facebook, in which case everything you do is subject to a kind of high-handed totalitarian regime, benevolent totalitarianism, which works great unless it doesn't, in which case they can make you use your real name, even if you are someone who'd be at risk if your real name was exposed. They can cut off your access to your friends and family. They can show you ads that use your dead relatives' names in them. All of these things are things that you don't have any recourse over. If you have a dishwasher, you can decide whose dishes go in it. But if you buy an iPhone, you can only put the apps in it that Apple has chosen, and you have to click through a big long contract to make sure that that stays that way. And this is creeping into other areas like our thermostats these days. Devices that you are not allowed to govern are necessarily devices that you're not allowed to understand. If you're allowed to understand how the devices that try to control you instead of taking orders from you, if you're allowed to understand how they work, then you can change them so that they take orders from you instead of from their mothership. And that is quite a collision course to be on, to be in a world full of technologies that we're not allowed to understand, because increasingly computers are creeping into our world. They are becoming the very fabric of our world. If you live in a new house built in the last 5 or 10 years, chances are it's a computer that you cohabitate in. If you take the computers out, the house becomes uninhabitable very quickly. If you leave the computers out for any length of time, it will be permanently uninhabitable, like those subprimes down in Florida, where when they shut the power off and the houses could no longer control their respiration and humidity, the black mold crept up the walls until they were teardowns. Your car is a computer that you drive down the road at 100 miles an hour in, while the computer takes care of all the hard stuff. Not self-driving cars, just cars. Your computer's a car, and we know that your car is a computer, and we know that because at Black Hat and at DEF CON, we've seen attacks on the Bluetooth interface in your car that allows an attacker to turn off your steering and your brakes.
Or the repo man.
Or the repo man these days. Yeah, that's right. And if you if you happen to fly in one of Seattle's most proud technical achievements, a Boeing 747, I flew to this landmass in one from London a few days ago. You are flying in a Sun Solaris workstation in a very fancy aluminum case connected to some tragically badly secured SCADA controllers. And we don't just put our bodies in potentially lethal machines these days. Our computers are also inside our bodies. If you grew up with the Walkman like me, or if you grew up with MP3 players, you will log enough punishing earbud hours that come the day, unless you get hit by a self-driving car first, you will definitely need a hearing aid, and that hearing aid is vanishingly unlikely to be a retro beige hipster analog transistorized hearing aid. It's going to be a computer that you put in your body, and it'll know what you hear, and it'll be able to tell other people what you hear, and it'll be able to stop you from hearing things that are there or make you hear things that aren't there, all depending on the characteristics of that computer, all depending on whether that computer is governed by we the people or you the sucker. And this is not science fiction. This has already arrived. I travel a lot, and if you travel a lot, you know the first law of frequent travel is ABC, always be charging. And so when you get to an airport lounge, you scan the baseboards for plugs. And you run over to the plugs and you seize the plug and you plug your laptop in to charge it before the flight. And there I was, charging my laptop on the only plug in the lounge, and a man came in and he said very cheekily, "Can I use that plug?" And I said, "I'm charging my laptop before the flight." And he rolled up his pants leg and showed me his robotic prosthetic leg, and he said, "I need to charge my leg before the flight." So people ask me if I'm optimistic or pessimistic about whether or not we're going to get to decide what our computers do. And optimism and pessimism are just another kind of prediction as far as I'm concerned. To be optimistic or pessimistic is to make a prediction about how the future is going to turn out. And I don't have a lot of time for either of them. I mean, for one thing, even if you were pessimistic about how the future was going to go, you would still probably do something to try and make it better, regardless of your chances. And that's not called optimism, that's called hope. Hope is why you tread water if your ship sinks in the middle of the ocean and you can't see any rescue ships, and keep treading water until you can't tread water any longer. Because not everybody who treaded water got rescued, but everybody who got rescued treaded water. And if one of your friends couldn't tread water and you were supporting them, you'd kick twice as hard. And, you know, the earth is full of my friends. And it's full of things that I love and care about. As the tick once said, "Don't destroy the world, that's where I keep all my stuff." And I want to fight for all this stuff, for a free, fair, and open information ecosystem that will give us a free, fair, and open society, because the internet is not a better video on demand service. It's not the world's most perfect pornography distribution system. It's not a tool for recruiting jihadis. It is the nervous system of the 21st century. And if we don't get it right, the stakes are unlimited. So this is a daunting task to have before us, but at least it's clear. If we're going to be free, we need to seize the means of information. And there are many organizations that are in the business of helping seize the means of information. You may be familiar with some of them. There's the Electronic Frontier Foundation at EFF.org. There's the Free Software Foundation at FSF.org. There's Public Knowledge. There's the American Civil Liberties Union, and many other organizations. Indeed, there are so many of them that it gives me great hope, because a few years ago, there weren't that many of them. This issue is coming home to so many people, because as the internet and computers have colonized every corner of our life, the urgency of getting computers right has likewise started to colonize many different quarters and corners of our world. Now, I know that it's hard to be pure. It's impossible to be pure. And so many of us contribute monetarily to things that take away from the chances of us having a free, fair, and open future. You may be buying fruit-flavored mobile devices, or giving money to Netflix, who engineer digital rights management in the very standards that run the web. Or you may be giving money to Comcast, who are fighting against net neutrality. And I'm not going to tell you that you can't do those things, because we live in the real. But what I am going to ask you is whether or not you buy my book. I hope you'll buy a book while you're here to help support this wonderful independent bookstore. But whether or not you buy my book, I hope that you'll consider taking a fraction of the money that you spend every month, every year on companies that are taking away the free, fair, and open internet, and engineering a future where the default posture of our devices is not yes, master, but I can't let you do that, Dave. And think about sending 20%, 50%, a dollar for dollar to one of those organizations of your choosing to help them fight so that the good things that we get out of our fruit-flavored devices and our Netflix and our cable delivery system are not used as Trojan horses to take away the future that we want to bequeath to our families. So with that, I'll take your questions, and then I will deface your books. Thank you. And I'll remind you that a long rambling statement followed by what do you think of that is technically a question, but not a good one. And I'll also remind you that you have half an hour to buy books before they shut the till. So are there any questions? You don't have to ask questions. Go.
I want to know how your story juxtaposed with the recent Gamergate controversy.
Goodness, no one's asked me that one yet. That's been the question of the day everywhere we've gone. So obviously Gamergate is big and important and tragic. And many of you probably know Brianna Wu, because she's local, who's been chased out of her house over Gamergate. And is a friend of mine and a friend of many of yours, I'm sure. She's also the partner of oh gosh, I'm blanking on his name, Bill Wu, the science fiction illustrator and Hugo winner. And obviously this is an extremely disturbing thing to have happened, the Gamergate thing, and it's something that is very upsetting. I think that writing a story in which gender and games collide, and then having that story come out at a time in which gender and games are colliding in the real world is a bit like shooting fish in a barrel, right? I think that there are, like, regardless of when this graphic novel had come out over the last 10 years, there was hardly a moment at which some scandal about misogyny in the internet was not in the news. And so in some ways, this is classic predicting the present stuff. Writing a story in which one of the central moving factors is creating safe spaces for women and online spaces where they are subject to harassment is not a stretch in terms of predicting what people might need to do as the future unrolls. I don't know exactly what gave us Gamergate, and I don't know exactly how it's going to end. I had a very fruitful, thought-provoking, long, passionate, and interesting discussion with Justine Larbalestier at Comic-Con a few days ago, where, as you do, we argued about intersectionality versus class struggle. And in a nutshell, the way that argument goes is that the most important thing, the intersectionality argument goes, the most important thing about the struggle, or the place where you locate the struggle, is in the reasons that you're discriminated against. So because you're gay, because you are from a visible minority, because you are poor, because you are whatever. And the class struggle argument goes that discrimination itself is that all of these are just epiphenomena of discrimination. And discrimination, it doesn't matter if we get gender equity, we will then all of that, unless we solve the reason that discrimination exists, whatever happens to whatever goes on that makes gender equity, you will then have that discriminatory energy go and discriminate against someone on some other basis, and that moreover, if the problem is the establishment, then helping people from groups that are excluded from the establishment join the establishment will just make them part of the establishment. Eric Holder is an African American, but he's still an authoritarian creep. And Margaret Thatcher is a woman, but she was also an authoritarian creep. And so it doesn't matter about this stuff. And so I took the class struggle side, and Justine took the intersectionality side, and we didn't come to any agreement, but we certainly provoked one another's thoughts at some length. And then I got to thinking about it, and I realized that there is something, to Justine's point, in Gamergate, which is not just that obviously the people who are being most victimized by Gamergate are women and not men. That's really clear. I've written an awful lot about Gamergate. I get a gentle bollocking on Twitter from people who kind of concern troll me. I thought you were better than that. And Brianna Wu posts a couple of memes, and she gets doxxed, and her home address is published along with explicit rape and murder threats, and she has to flee her home. So it's really clear that this is not the same fight for everyone. But what is interesting to me is not what the bad guys are doing, but what the good people are doing. And it does strike a blow for intersectionality, I have to say, for Justine's side here. So my wife is a games professional. She played Quake on the British national team, subsequently represented, so she represented her country on an international stage playing video games. Subsequently was a games publisher for the BBC and then for Channel 4. Still sits on the board of Yuki, which is the games industry body in the United Kingdom. And in her circle are all these very high-powered women from the gaming industry, gaming executives and so on. And the class struggle argument about this would predict that those women would say, well, if you're troubled by discrimination, just suck it up. I got here, I developed a thick skin, you should develop a thick skin too. This is, women can succeed, it is a meritocracy. Meritocracy is usually, when people argue that they live in a meritocracy, what they usually mean is that this must be a meritocracy because I'm the best person I know and here I am sitting on top, therefore the system works. And that's not what's happened with Gamergate. All of the senior women that I know of in the industry are extremely upset about Gamergate and are speaking out against it and are saying that these things are real and are saying that just because they made it does not mean that the issues that the victims of Gamergate or the targets of Gamergate, I don't like the word victim very much in that sentence, the targets of Gamergate, all of the grievances they have are real and immediate, and the existence of a few women who have managed to make it to the top proves nothing to contradict that. And so that actually gives me some hope that it is possible to climb to the top of the mountain of manure to pluck the single rose without losing your sense of smell. So can we have maybe we'll alternate genders. Is there a woman who would like to ask a question? Yeah.
So for those of us who are timid and shy because we hear about things like this, I mean, not that I have that much to offer, but I feel like offering nothing because I'm afraid that that is going to target me in some small or big way.
What should you
I don't know
do?
what to do with that.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that the risks for you are greater than the risks for me of speaking out about it. I wouldn't fault you at all for having your speech chilled by that, because I think that we've seen what's happened to women who spoke out, and it's not, it's not nice. I certainly would never ask anyone to take that risk, because it seems like that's not a fair thing to ask of people. That said, you know, we have seen from people like Brianna Wu essays in which they refuse to back down, even in the face of all of these threats, and in which she said that she would refuse to be silenced and she would take the fight to them. And you know, it may be that we're just going up the Gandhian curve. First they ignore you, then they fight you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then we win. It can take a long time to get to win, but maybe that's what we're doing. And if you have it in you, if you have the ability to do that, and it's not just masochism, then I would support you in speaking out against it. But I don't have any great advice for making sociopaths not target you, because it's terrible, right? I mean, it's really awful. It's shameful. And it's a shame, it's a kind of shame on our species, really, to see people behave this way. It's really something.
Got some of them in Congress, too.
Huh?
Got some of them in Congress, too.
Got some of them in Congress, too. It's very true. Yeah, go ahead.
Tangentially off of this.
Sure.
Any science fiction people tackling our current questions about inequality?
Science fiction writers tackling questions about inequality. I think that there's tons of that work being done, for sure. I mean, Shauna McGuire writes very eloquently about this stuff. And as does, I think if you want to read work that really talks about this, it is so shot through all of Jo Walton's work. She's so good. I mean, it's never dead on kind of parable, although her next book is a dead on parable about this stuff. But, you know, even books like My Real Children, which is one of the best books I've ever read, or gosh, what was it called? The one that won all the awards that I loved. Among Others. Those are books that really do ask questions about equality and inequality. The next one that's coming out, called The Just City, which I'm almost finished the advanced copy of, is about Athene gathering to her all the people who ever prayed to her to live in Plato's Republic, and sending them back to the island that later became Atlantis when the volcano erupted, to live out. So because they can do things there without changing the future, and so fate will allow it to happen. And she brings them all back, and they recreate Plato's Republic. And they bring in slave children, 10-year-old slave children, and they raise them to be the philosopher kings of the society. And it is very explicitly a parable about questions of equality and inequality. And as you might expect if you've read Jo's work, it's absolutely brilliant. I did see that they have signed copies of Jo's In Real Life here, which is, if you haven't read it, is a treat. And a harrowing experience in its own way, but also quite wonderful. I read the advanced copy before speaking at XOXO in Portland. I flew from London to Portland and had a 10 a.m. start the next day, and thought, I really need to get to bed. I'll just read one chapter of this. And I stayed up all night, and I read it cover to cover, and I wept my way through all of the Kleenex, all of the toilet paper, all of the face cloths, all of the towels, and all of the linens in the process of reading it. And it's a book whose ending isn't exactly happy or unhappy. I think that's not a spoiler. But it's a book the sweetness of whose ending is informed by the harrowing nature of all the stuff that comes before it. It is one of the most cathartic books I've ever read. So I certainly recommend that to you.
Name again?
It's called My Real Children by Jo Walton. And can we have a question from a woman? If there are any? Not women, questions from women. I know there are women. No? How about another question from a man then? Go ahead.
I organize amongst labor unions.
Uh-huh.
And that's predominantly a place where even here in Seattle, up in North Seattle, it's predominantly people of color.
Mm-hmm.
It's people from a variety of class backgrounds. And you mentioned a bunch of different organizations that are wonderful organizations,
Mm-hmm.
but having been around, I'm looking for, I read For the Win, and I think every labor organizer should read that book.
Mm-hmm.
It is so inspirational, and what I'm looking for is something that I could communicate to my colleagues who are organizing with me. There is an organization that is forward-thinking, that is thinking about these things, and but also has your point of view well respected and represented.
So I'm not sure. I think that the best thing to do is to look for stuff like SEIU and look at their technology groups inside them. Because I think that the groups that work just on the technology question want to have a broader tent than that. One of the most instructive moments in my career at EFF was when there was a notice of proposed rulemaking to write software that would take comments sent to administrative agencies like the Forestry Department or the EPA or the FCC or whatever, NASA, and would look to see whether they were substantively similar and then discard them if they were substantively similar to other remarks. So they would only get because it's not supposed to be a plebiscite, it's just supposed to be expert feedback. And you can see that there's an awful lot of potential for mischief if you're writing a secret algorithm that discards comments sent to the government in its rulemakings. And when we started to organize about that, every single group from every single point of view got under the umbrella. So we had anti-choice groups and pro-choice groups, anti-gun groups and pro-gun groups. I mean, basically, we had to draw the line at the KKK because everybody wants an open infrastructure for intervening in regulatory questions. Regardless of what their issues are, they want to have this infrastructure available to them. And so the activist groups that work just on these information questions try really hard to keep it to those information questions. The Free Software Foundation is a little more explicit about the connection between labor and code, but even they are try not to make that at the center of their analysis. They really try to make the center of their analysis about the freedom that the code gives everybody. Because, depending on your point of view, either because everybody deserves it or possibly because if you create a kind of, if you draw a circle around who gets freedom and who doesn't and define some criteria about it, then people who are really powerful will always be able to find a way to define their way into the circle and to take the people who genuinely threaten them and define them out of the circle. And so the technology groups tend to be like nonpartisan small p in terms of labor politics because they understand that, to give you a great example, they understand that Netflix wants to lobby for network neutrality, but that they also want to lobby to take away code freedom with DRM. And so they want to be able to let Netflix come in on the action in which they're lobbying very effectively for network neutrality, and they want to be able to say, when the question is digital rights management in browser design, that Netflix is terrible and is destroying the web. And they want to be able to have both of those positions. And the only way they can do that is if the only ideology to which they hew is network freedom and not labor issues, or any other issue, because it lets them walk that line down the middle. And it makes them kind of an honest broker of these questions. So that's where most of those groups stand. I mean, there are some of them that are more kind of politically left than others, demand progress, obviously, and also fight for the future, which have a lot of overlapping organizer membership. But really, I think that the best way, if you want to get partisanship, small p, into your circle, is to start a tech activist affinity group within whatever your cause is, whether it's environmental causes or labor organizing or whatever, and then call on these other groups to help you kind of get organized and get your technology stuff right, because that's really what they should be doing, is they should be kind of seeding everybody's own technology groups. So EFF has had contact with people like Zach Exley, who was Howard Dean's technology person and ran that campaign, but they've also had connections with people like Derek Khanna, who's a Republican staffer, GOP staffer, who fights for phone unlocking, and they are willing to support them both because the issues that they're supporting on are related to kind of open, free, and fair information infrastructure, without regard to the other issues, right? That's the thing that that they will be the honest brokers of. If you need to do that, they will help you with that. I hope that answers your questions. Any other questions from women this time? No? Okay. Yes, go ahead.
1984 was written in England,
Yeah,
and now England has more cameras per capita on the street.
it sure does. Yeah, as many people reminded Tony Blair, 1984 is not intended as a manual for statecraft. And it's true. England has really kind of raced ahead of the U.S. on questions of surveillance. I mean, the NSA obviously has more budget and more ambition, but the UK has less shame when it comes to it. They're a lot more open about it. And it's very frustrating. We've just had a senior MI5 official say that Britons should get used to having less freedom because it's the only way they can have security. Like literally those words, right? I mean, kind of the irony, it burns, right? I think that if there is a difference, it's the Constitution. And so I grew up without the Constitution. I'm Canadian. And I have great respect for the Bill of Rights, although I'm more of a 9 out of 10. The thing that the Bill of Rights gets you is not the Bill of Rights. We don't actually have all the rights enumerated in the Bill of Rights. What it gets you is, as they say, all countries fail to live up to their aspirations. The U.S. fails to live up to better aspirations than most. And what it gets you is the potential to use the judiciary to move the political needle when Congress won't. And much of the interesting stuff happening in lawmaking these days is happening out of the judiciary. The way that we got strong cryptography was not by getting Congress to force the NSA to stop banning it as a munition, not by making arguments about how the nation's banks were being asked to secure themselves with the equivalent of rubber bands and wishful thinking, that because the NSA wanted to be sure that they could read everybody's email if it came to it. And it wasn't by making technical arguments about the merits or demerits of the ciphers that the NSA said were strong enough for us to use and would keep us safe, but not so safe that they couldn't spy on us. The way that we won that argument was by representing Dan Bernstein, a mathematician, who argued that he had a First Amendment right to publish the source code to make strong ciphers. And the Ninth Circuit and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals both found that Dan had that right. And so this is a thing that you don't get so much in the UK. We have it to a limited extent through the European Court of Justice, the European Court of Human Rights, which not coincidentally, the Conservative government wants to pull the UK out of, mostly on the grounds of a bunch of largely imaginary stories about people who are allegedly jihadis who they want to deport and who they've had to actually give trials to before they could deport them. And that those trials took a long time, largely because they prosecuted them through programs of dirty tricks that ended up with all of their evidence being excluded because they couldn't keep their investigation in their pants. Maybe one more question? Yeah.
I would like you to weigh in on the current happenings in Ferguson.
Ferguson. Ay. It's all easy questions tonight. I don't pretend to be an expert on it, but the parts of the Ferguson stuff that seem to be in my wheelhouse are that the story didn't get a lot of play until the internet made it impossible to look away. That seems pretty significant. The debate has been carried out online in ways that we are not used to seeing. That the production of real-time documentation of the goings-on in Ferguson has been critical in shaping the way that we think about it. And that the global perception of America has been shaped by the internet feeds out of Ferguson, and that has actually put pressure on the American authorities to do something about it in part. So on that note, I'll thank you all very much for coming. I hope I'll see some of you next week when I'm with Neil, and then this summer when I'm back for Clarion West. And again, I hope you'll support the bookstore by buying a book, even if it's not one of mine. Thank you very much.